Take the silver tray to Seraphine's chambers, and do try not to spill on the way. She dislikes clumsiness in servants." Those were the words that broke something inside Elowen Verith, though her face did not so much as flicker. She had been Lunar of the Ashmore pack for 7 years, mate and wife and queen beside Kaelan Ashmore, and now he stood in the doorway of their shared hall with his arm around another woman's waist, ordering her to carry breakfast to his mistress, as though she were nothing more than a maid in her own home. The bond between them, the sacred wolf tether that had bound her soul to his since the night of their mating, gave a wet, tearing lurch inside her chest, a sensation like a rope of muscle being slowly unwound from around her ribs. She tasted copper. Her knees threatened to fold. But Elowen Verith didn't fold. She looked at the tray, and she looked at the golden-haired woman draped against her husband, and she made a decision in that half-heartbeat of silence that would outlast every stone in that fortress. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would simply, quietly, become someone he could never command again. The great hall of Ashmore Keep smelled of wood smoke and the crushed lavender the servants scattered across the floors, and beneath it, faint and sour, the cologne Seraphine favoured, the one that clung to Kaelan's collar, now like a brand. Elowen had noticed the scent weeks ago. She had noticed a great many things. That was the curse and the gift of being underestimated. People spoke freely in front of the invisible. She had heard the whispers in the training yards, seen the way the elder wolves averted their eyes when she passed, felt the slow cooling of the mate bond as Kaelan spent, night after night, in the eastern wing where Seraphine had been given rooms 3 months prior. A visiting dignitary, he'd called her then, the daughter of an allied pack come to strengthen ties. Elowen had believed him, because she had been raised to believe that loyalty was a thing you gave and a thing you received, an even exchange, a law of the world as fixed as the phases of the moon. She understood now, standing with copper on her tongue and her husband's cruelty ringing in her ears, that loyalty had never been a law. It had only ever been a story she told herself to make the cage feel like a home. "Did you hear me, Elowen?" Kaelan said, and there was an edge in his voice now, impatience dressed up as authority. He was a beautiful man in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, all broad shoulders and dark hair, and a jaw that had made half the pack's daughters sigh when he'd come of age. She had been one of them once. She remembered the girl who had loved him with her whole trembling heart, and she mourned that girl the way you mourn the dead. "The tray. Seraphine is waiting." Seraphine smiled. It was a small, curved, satisfied thing, the smile of a woman who had won a contest her opponent hadn't known she was fighting. "It's all right, darling," she purred, tightening her grip on Kaelan's arm. "I'm sure she'll learn. Some women simply take longer to understand their place." Her eyes flicked over Elowen the way one might assess a horse before deciding not to buy it. "Though I do think, once we're properly settled, we ought to consider whether the keep really needs 2 women fussing over the same duties. It's rather crowded, don't you think?" The threat beneath the silk was unmistakable. Elowen understood that she was being told, in the politest possible terms, that her days here were numbered, that the woman on Kaelan's arm intended not merely to share the keep, but to inherit it, and that Elowen herself was to be diminished, degraded, and eventually discarded like a garment gone out of fashion. And Kaelan, her mate, the wolf whose scent had once meant safety to her, said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not even look ashamed. He simply raised one dark eyebrow and waited for her to pick up the tray. So she did. She crossed the hall on legs that did not shake, though every muscle in them screamed. She lifted the silver tray with its porcelain cups and its little dish of honeyed figs, and she felt the weight of it settle into her arms, and she carried it toward the eastern wing with her spine as straight as a drawn blade. Behind her she heard Seraphine laugh, low and pleased, and she heard Kaelin murmur something that made the other woman laugh again. Eloan did not turn around. She walked the long stone corridor with the morning light falling through the arrow-slit windows in pale gold bars across the floor, and with each step she felt the last of her grief harden into something colder and far more useful. She set the tray down on the table in Seraphine's chambers, arranged the cups precisely, poured the tea without spilling a single drop. Then she straightened, looked at the room that had been decorated with silks and mirrors bought with pack coin, and said, very quietly, to no one at all, "Enjoy it while it lasts." She did not know yet exactly how she would do it. She only knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter, that she would leave this place, and that when she returned, if she returned, it would not be as anyone's servant, and it would not be to serve. The mate bond throbbed in her chest, frayed and bleeding at its edges, and for the first time in 7 years she did not try to soothe it or feed it or pretend it was whole. She let it hurt. She let it teach her. Pain, she was learning, was information, and Eloan Verith had always been very, very good at gathering information. That night, after the keep had fallen quiet, and Kaelin had once again gone to the eastern wing, Eloan sat alone in the chambers she had shared with him for 7 years, and took an honest inventory of her life. It did not take long. The furs on the bed, the jewelry and the carved box on the vanity, the fine gowns hanging in the wardrobe, the title of Luna itself. None of it was truly hers. All of it had been given, and what is given can be taken, and a person who owns nothing they cannot carry owns nothing at all. She understood this now, with a clarity that should have terrified her, but instead felt almost like relief. She was not being robbed. She was being freed, if only she was brave enough to take the freedom. She rose from the edge of the bed and went to the wardrobe, and from beneath a false panel at its base, a panel she had built herself with her own hands 3 years ago, during a season when Kaelin had been away at the summer councils, and she had first begun to suspect that her position was less secure than she had been led to believe. She withdrew a small leather satchel. Inside was everything that was actually hers. A pouch of coins she had saved slowly, invisibly, skimming nothing from the pack treasury, but setting aside her own personal allowance, season after season, until it had grown into a modest fortune. A set of documents establishing, under a name that was not Ashmore, and not even entirely Verith, a small trading concern registered in the free city of Cindermarch, 2 days' ride to the south. A ledger in her own precise hand, detailing every trade route, every contact, every debt owed and favor banked that she had cultivated in secret over the past several years, while everyone assumed she was merely the ornamental wife of a powerful alpha. Eloan had never been merely ornamental. She had run the domestic accounts of Ashmore Keep for 7 years. She had negotiated the grain contracts, managed the winter stores, brokered the marriages that kept the lesser families loyal, and quietly learned, in the process, exactly how power actually moved through the world, not through fangs and fury, but through supply and debt and the slow, patient accumulation of leverage. Kaelin had never once thanked her for it. He had never even seemed to notice. That, she reflected now, would prove to be the most expensive oversight of his life. There was a soft knock at the door. Eloan slid the satchel behind her back before she called out, "Come." and the door opened to admit a woman older than herself, grey-haired and stooped, with hands gnarled from decades of work and eyes that missed nothing. Mart had been a servant in Ashmore Keep since before Caelan was born. She had raised him, in truth, more than his own late mother had, and she had watched Elowen come into the keep as a frightened young bride and grow into the woman who actually held the household together. Marta closed the door behind her and stood for a long moment in the candlelight. And then she said simply, "So you're leaving?" It was not a question. Elowen felt her throat tighten. "How did you know?" "Because I would," Marta said. "Because you're too clever to stay and be trampled, and I've watched you gather your little threads for 3 years now, child. I say nothing, but I see everything. It's the only power an old servant has left." She crossed the room and took Elowen's hands in her own dry, warm ones. "He's a fool. I raised him and I love him, and he is a fool, and that woman is worse than a fool. She's a knife wearing a smile. You mustn't be here when the blade comes down." "I don't intend to be," Elowen said. Marta nodded slowly. Then, from the pocket of her apron, she produced an iron key, old and heavy and worn smooth by generations of hands. "The postern gate below the kitchen cellar," she said. "The one everyone's forgotten. It opens onto the goat path down the eastern slope, and from there you can reach the south road without passing a single guard. I've kept this key for 40 years and never once had a use for it. I think perhaps I was keeping it for you." She pressed it into Elowen's palm and closed her fingers over it. "Go tonight. Go before you can talk yourself out of it. And Elowen," her voice caught just slightly, "when you become whatever it is you're going to become, don't come back small. Come back as the storm." Elowen embraced the old woman, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was leaving. Not the title, not the furs, but this. The handful of people in this cold keep who had seen her as a person rather than a possession. Then she released her, wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand, and set about the methodical business of vanishing. She dressed in the plainest travelling clothes she owned, dark wool and sturdy boots, garments she had bought with her own coin, and that carried no scent of Caelan upon them. She left the jewellery in its box. She left the fine gowns in the wardrobe. She took the mate ring from her finger, the heavy silver band Caelan had placed there 7 years ago, beneath the full moon, and she looked at it for a long moment in the candlelight, and then she set it gently on his pillow where he would find it. Let him understand, when he returned from Seraphine's bed, precisely what he had thrown away. The satchel over her shoulder weighed almost nothing. It held her entire future. She moved through the sleeping keep like a ghost, down the winding stair to the kitchens, through the cellar where the winter apples were stored in their fragrant wooden crates, to the low iron door in the far wall that no one had opened in longer than she had been alive. The key turned with a groan of rust, and then the door swung outward onto the cold, clean dark of the mountain night, and the air that rushed in smelled of pine and frost and freedom. Elowen stepped through it. She did not look back at the keep. Looking back was for people who still believed they had left something behind worth wanting, and she had learned, in the space of a single morning, that she had not. She pulled the door shut behind her, and she began to walk down the goat path in the starlight, and somewhere in her chest the frayed mate bond gave a final, agonizing wrench, and then, mercifully, went numb. She would feel it again later, in the small hours of the coming weeks, a phantom ache where love used to live. But for now there was only the path, and the dark, and the south road, waiting to carry her toward a life that belonged to no one but herself. By the time the sun rose over the eastern peaks, Elowen Verith was 15 miles from Ashmore Keep and had not yet been missed. Caelan, when he finally returned to the marital chambers near midday, unhurried, unbothered, expecting to find his wife where he had left her, chastened and obedient, found instead a cold hearth, an empty wardrobe half its former weight, and a single silver ring resting on his pillow like an accusation. It took him a strange, stretched moment to understand what he was looking at. When understanding came, it came not as grief, for he did not yet love her enough to grieve, but as irritation, a petulant sense that a convenience had been withdrawn without his permission. He would learn to grieve later. That lesson, like so many others, would arrive far too late to do him any good. Cindermarch was a city that had grown up around a river crossing, where 3 trade roads met. A sprawling, smoky, restless place of warehouses and counting houses and merchant guilds, where a person's worth was measured not by their bloodline or their bite, but by the contents of their ledgers and the reliability of their word. It was, Elowen thought, as she rode into it on the back of a hired cart that first grey morning, the most honest place she had ever seen. No one here pretended that loyalty was free. No one wrapped naked ambition in the language of duty and devotion. In Cindermarch, everyone was buying and selling, and everyone knew it, and there was a kind of clean, cold relief in that after 7 years of pretty lies. She had a small warehouse here, purchased in secret through intermediaries over the past 3 years, and a business registered under the name Elowen March, a name she had chosen for its plainness, its anonymity, its complete absence of any wolf or any keep. She had a modest stock of goods and a modest sum of coin, and a mind that had spent 7 years learning exactly how commerce moved through this region, while everyone assumed she was arranging flowers. She had, in other words, everything she needed to begin. What she did not have was time to waste on grief. So she did not waste it. She rose before dawn each morning and worked until she could no longer keep her eyes open, and slowly, methodically, she began to build. Her first venture was small. She had noticed, in her years managing the Ashmore accounts, that the mountain packs of the north paid exorbitant prices for the medicinal herbs that grew abundantly in the southern lowlands, because the trade in those herbs was controlled by a cartel of guild merchants who marked up their prices 10-fold and treated the wolf packs with contempt. Elowen, who spoke the mountain dialects and understood the pack's pride and knew precisely how to negotiate with them, because she had been one of them, saw an opportunity where others saw only a difficult and disagreeable market. She sourced the herbs directly from the lowland growers, cutting out the cartel entirely, and she sold them to the northern packs at a fair price with a fair margin, and she treated the pack representatives who came to her warehouse not as savages to be fleeced, but as partners to be respected. Word spread. The packs, unused to being dealt with honestly, became fiercely loyal customers. Within 4 months, Elowen March had cornered the entire northern herb trade, and the guild cartel that had held it for a generation was hemorrhaging money and did not yet understand why. She was careful. She was patient. She did not draw attention to herself, did not flaunt her growing wealth, did not make enemies she could avoid. She lived simply in a set of rooms above her warehouse, ate plain food, wore plain clothes, and poured every coin she earned back into the business. And slowly, as the months passed, the small trading concern of Elowen March grew into something considerably larger. She expanded into textiles, then into ironmongery, then into the lucrative and delicate business of financing, lending coin to other merchants at fair rates, taking equity in promising ventures, weaving herself quietly but inextricably into the financial fabric of the entire region. She had a gift for it, a gift she had never been permitted to fully exercise within the narrow confines of a domestic household. She could look at a tangle of debts and obligations and see the hidden structure beneath, the pressure points and the leverage, the way one carefully placed loan could bring an entire rival concern under her influence without a single harsh word ever being spoken. She was, she discovered, extraordinarily good at this, and more than that, she enjoyed it. For the first time in her life, Elowen Vaerith was doing work that fully engaged every faculty she possessed, and the pleasure of it was a revelation that nearly made the pain of her leaving worthwhile. It was in her 6th month in Cindermarch that she met Torvald Renner. He came to her warehouse on a rainy afternoon to negotiate a shipping contract, a broad-shouldered man with silver threading through his dark beard and shrewd, kind eyes, the master of the largest independent shipping fleet on the river. He was, she would learn, precisely the sort of man Kaelan was not. He had built everything he had with his own hands. He respected competence above all other qualities, and he had absolutely no interest in whether a person was high-born or low-born, wolf or human, man or woman, so long as they were good at what they did. He watched Elowen negotiate the shipping contract with a small, growing smile, and when they had concluded their business, her getting the better of the deal, which he seemed to find delightful rather than offensive, he said, "You're new to Cindermarch, Mistress March, but you negotiate like you've been doing this for a century. Where did you learn it?" "In a place that no longer exists," Elowen said, "from people who never knew they were teaching me." Torvald laughed, a big warm sound that filled the warehouse. "That's the truest answer I've heard in years." He extended his hand, and she took it, and something in the honest, firm grip of it steadied a part of her she hadn't realized was still shaking. "I have a feeling," he said, "that you and I are going to do a great deal of business together." He was right. Over the following months, their partnership grew from a single contract into a genuine alliance, his fleet carrying her goods, her financing expanding his operations, the two of them building something together that was greater than either could have built alone. And if, over those months, a warmth grew between them that was more than merely professional, a slow, careful thing, built on respect rather than possession, on partnership rather than ownership. Elowen didn't fight it, though she didn't rush toward it either. She had learned to be careful with her heart. But she had also learned, in Torvald's steady company, that not all men were Kaelan, that a person could be loved for what they were, and not merely for what they provided, and that lesson healed something in her that all her success had not quite reached. Meanwhile, 2 days' ride to the north, the world she had left behind was quietly rotting. It began, as these things do, with small failures that no one connected to the woman who had vanished. The winter stores, which Elowen had always managed with meticulous care, ran short in the 2nd month of the cold season because Seraphine, who had appointed herself mistress of the keep, considered such tasks beneath her and delegated them to servants who had never been properly trained because Elowen had always done the training herself. The grain contracts, which Elowen had renegotiated favorably every autumn, lapsed and were replaced with terms so unfavorable that the pack found itself paying nearly double for its bread. The lesser families, whose loyalty Elowen had maintained through a delicate web of marriages and favors and personal attention, began to drift, first in their affections and then in their tithes, because Seraphine treated them with the same contempt she treated everyone she deemed beneath her, and Kaelan, distracted and indulgent, did nothing to stop her. One by one, The threads that Elowen had woven so patiently over 7 years came loose, and no one in Ashmore Keep possessed either the skill or the will to weave them again. Kaelan noticed the fraying in his way. He noticed that the treasury was emptier than it should have been, that the servants were surly, that the elder wolves who had once come to him with counsel now came less often and spoke more coldly when they did. He noticed that the keep, which had once run so smoothly he had never had to think about it, now seemed to lurch from one small crisis to the next. But he did not understand why, because he had never understood what Elowen had done, had never once considered that the seamless functioning of his household had been the product of ceaseless invisible labor rather than some natural order of things. He assumed, in the arrogant way of men who have always been served, that the problems were the fault of lazy servants, or bad luck, or the general decline of standards, and he berated the staff and demanded better, and grew increasingly bad-tempered when better did not materialize. Seraphine, for her part, seemed entirely untroubled by the deterioration. She spent the pack's coin on silks and jewels and elaborate feasts, and when Kaelan raised the matter of the empty treasury, she stroked his jaw and told him not to trouble himself with such tedious things, that a great alpha should not concern himself with counting coins like a common merchant. Kaelan, who wanted very much to believe this, believed it. He did not know that Seraphine had not come to Ashmore to love him. He did not know that she had come at the direction of her true master, a man named Corvin Draylock, the alpha of the Blackthorn pack that bordered Ashmore to the west, a cold and patient predator who had coveted the Ashmore lands for a decade, and who had concluded, quite correctly, that the most efficient way to conquer a rival was not to fight him, but to hollow him out from within. Seraphine was Corvin's creature, his half-sister and his instrument, sent to seduce the Ashmore alpha, isolate him from his most competent adviser, Elowen, whose reputation for shrewdness Corvin had learned to fear, and steer the pack gently but inexorably toward ruin, until it was so weakened that Corvin could absorb it without a single sword being drawn. The plan had worked better than Corvin had dared hope, in large part because Kaelan had done the hardest part himself. He had driven away the one person capable of protecting his pack, and he had done it out of nothing more than lust and pride, and the careless cruelty of a man who had never learned that things given can be taken away. Corvin Draylock had not counted on Elowen surviving her exile. He had assumed, when word reached him that the Ashmore Luna had fled in the night, that she would fade into obscurity and poverty and irrelevance, as discarded wives generally did. He had not troubled to have her followed. This oversight, small at the time, would prove to be the thread that unravelled his entire careful design, because while Corvin's plan hollowed out Ashmore Keep, the woman he had dismissed was building, 2 days to the south, a commercial empire that would soon give her more real power than any alpha's fangs. The convergence began with grain. By the end of Elowen's first year in Cinder Marsh, the northern pack's failing harvests and lapsed contracts had left them desperate for food, and the only merchant in the entire region with the reserves, the shipping capacity, and the willingness to supply them at a fair price was Elowen March. She had, without any of the packs quite realizing it, become the keystone upon which their survival now rested. When the Ashmore pack, reduced by mismanagement to genuine hunger as the winter deepened, sent representatives south to purchase emergency grain, they came to the warehouses of Elowen March because there was nowhere else to go. And when Corvin Draylock's Blackthorn pack, poised to make its final move against the starving Ashmore, likewise found itself dependent on southern grain to feed its own gathering army, they too came to the warehouses of Elowen March, because she had, quietly and deliberately, bought out or bankrupted every competing supplier in the region over the preceding months. She held them all now, all the northern packs, in the palm of her hand, and none of them yet knew whose hand it was. She had known this day would come. She had planned for it. From the moment she had understood, through the ledger of contacts she still maintained, and the steady flow of intelligence she purchased from travellers and merchants passing through Cindermarch, that Seraphine was Corvin's agent, and that Ashmore was being deliberately destroyed, Elowen had bent her every effort toward positioning herself as the indispensable supplier of the one thing all the northern packs would eventually need most. It had cost her enormously. It had required patience that bordered on the inhuman, watching from a distance as the pack that had once been her home starved and suffered, resisting every impulse to intervene prematurely, waiting for the precise moment when her leverage would be absolute. But Elowen Verith had learned, in the cold clarity of her betrayal, that vindication served too soon is merely vengeance, messy and incomplete, while vindication served at exactly the right moment is justice, clean and total and irreversible. She had waited, and now the moment had come. She received the Ashmore delegation in the great counting house she had built at the heart of Cindermarch, a soaring stone hall of ledgers and lamplight where the commerce of the entire region now flowed through her hands. She wore a gown of deep charcoal silk, unornamented, save for a single silver pin at her throat, and she sat behind a great desk of dark polished wood with a fire burning at her back. And when the Ashmore representatives were shown in, footsore, anxious, humbled by their pack's desperation, she saw among them a face she knew. It was Bram, an elder wolf who had served on Kaelin's council for 30 years, a principled and clear-eyed old man who had never quite hidden his disapproval of the way the Luna had been treated. His eyes widened when he saw her. His mouth fell open. And then, slowly, wonderingly, a smile spread across his weathered face, the smile of a man watching a long-deferred justice finally arrive. "Luna," he breathed. "Not Luna," Elowen said, and her voice was calm and cool and carried effortlessly across the hall. "Not any more. In Cindermarch I am simply Elowen March, and I am the woman who holds the grain your pack needs to survive the winter." She folded her hands upon the desk. "Sit, Bram. We have a great deal to discuss." What she offered them was salvation, but it was salvation on her terms. She would supply the Ashmore pack with all the grain it needed to survive the winter and to plant in the spring, more than enough, delivered swiftly, at a price so fair it bordered on charity. But her assistance came with conditions, and the conditions were these: that she be granted, in perpetuity, exclusive rights to broker all of Ashmore's trade, restoring the pack's commerce to the healthy footing it had enjoyed under her stewardship; that the pack's council be reconstituted to include the lesser families whose loyalty had been squandered, and that a single individual, one Seraphine, currently resident in Ashmore Keep, be investigated for her role in the pack's deliberate impoverishment, with all her expenditures from the treasury audited and accounted for. Bram, who had suspected Seraphine of exactly this from the beginning and had been powerless to prove it, agreed to every condition before Elowen had finished speaking. The other representatives, seeing no alternative to starvation, agreed as well. And so it was that Elowen March, without raising her voice or baring a single fang, took control of the economic destiny of the pack that had discarded her. But she was not finished, because there remained the matter of Corvin Draylock, and the matter of Seraphine, and the matter of a man named Kaelin Ashmore, who did not yet know that the wife he had ordered to serve his mistress now held his entire world in the palm of her hand. The reckoning came to her, in the end, as she had always known it would. She did not have to go to Ashmore. Ashmore came to her. It was Kaelan himself who made the journey south, though not, at first, to see her. The grain audit had done its work. Seraphine's monstrous expenditures had been laid bare, the pattern of deliberate sabotage exposed, and worst of all, Bram's investigation had uncovered the correspondence between Seraphine and her true master, Corvin Draylock, proving beyond doubt that the woman Kaelan had brought into his home and his bed was an enemy agent who had come to destroy him. The revelation shattered whatever infatuation had blinded him. He had cast Seraphine out of the keep in a rage. She had fled west, back toward Blackthorn, only to find that Corvin, whose plan she had failed to complete, had no further use for a spent instrument, and turned her away at his gates, leaving her to disappear into the anonymous poverty she had once threatened Elowen with. And Kaelan, standing amid the wreckage of the pack his own folly had nearly destroyed, learned at last the full extent of what he had thrown away. He learned that the mysterious merchant Elowen March, the woman who now held Ashmore's survival in her hands, was none other than the wife he had ordered to carry a breakfast tray. Bram told him. Bram, it must be said, took no small pleasure in the telling. So Kaelan came south to Cindermarch, and he came as a supplicant, though his pride would not let him fully admit it even to himself. He told himself he was coming to negotiate, to reason, perhaps to appeal to whatever affection Elowen might still hold for the pack, if not for him. He rode into the smoky, bustling city on a fine horse in his finest cloak, the trappings of an alpha, and he presented himself at the counting-house of Elowen March, expecting— he could not help it, it was bred into his very bones— expecting to be received as a king. He was shown into the great hall of ledgers and lamplight, and he stood before the wide, dark desk with its fire burning behind it, and the chair behind the desk was turned away from him, its high back facing him so that he could not see who sat in it. He waited. He was not accustomed to waiting. The impatience rose in him, the old petulant authority, and he opened his mouth to demand attention. And then the chair turned. Elowen looked at him across the desk, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. She simply looked. She looked at the man she had loved with her whole trembling heart, the man whose scent had once meant safety, the man who had stood in the doorway of their shared hall and ordered her to serve his mistress as though she were nothing. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was grey at his temples that had not been there before, and his fine cloak could not disguise the way desperation had hollowed his handsome face. The mate bond, long dormant, gave a faint, dull throb in her chest. A ghost of a ghost, the memory of a wound rather than the wound itself, and she noted it, and she set it aside, and she found to her quiet satisfaction that it had no power over her at all. "Hello, Kaelan," she said. She watched the recognition break across his face, watched him understand fully and finally who he was facing, and she watched the careful composure he had ridden in, with collapse, into something raw and stunned and afraid. "Elowen," he said. Her name came out of him like a wound. "You all this, it's you. It's all you." "It's all me," she agreed. He took a step toward the desk, his hands coming up in a gesture that might have been pleading or might have been an attempt to reassert an authority he no longer possessed. "Elowen, the things I said, the way I was bewitched, don't you see? That woman, Seraphine, she was Corvin's agent. She poisoned my judgment. She did not order me to carry a breakfast tray," Elowen said. Her voice was very quiet. It cut through his babbling like a blade through silk. "You did that. She did not stand beside you in silence while I was humiliated in my own home. You did that. She did not spend 7 years mistaking my labor for the natural order of things and my loyalty for something you were owed. You did all of that, Kaelin, and you did it long before Seraphine ever set foot in your keep. She only saw what you had already made of me, a thing to be used and discarded. She simply understood my worth better than you ever did. She understood it well enough to want me gone. Ellawen rose from the chair, and she came around the desk, and she stood before him, not as a supplicant and not as a subordinate, but as an equal who had, in every way that mattered, surpassed him. "That doesn't work on me anymore," she said. "The pleading, the excuses, the reaching for a bond that you broke with your own hands. I felt it break, Kaelin. I felt it tear. That morning in the hall, while you looked at me and felt nothing. So do not stand in my house and speak to me of bewitchment. You were not bewitched. You were simply cruel and careless, and you assumed that I would always be there to serve you. You assumed wrong." He had no answer. There was no answer to give. He stood in the center of that great hall of commerce, the trappings of his alpha rank suddenly meaningless in a place where rank meant nothing and only worth mattered. And he understood at last the full magnitude of his error, not merely that he had lost a wife, but that he had lost a partner whose brilliance he had never once perceived, a woman who had held his entire world together with her invisible hands, and whom he had thrown away for a smile and a scent. The knowledge broke something in him. He sank slowly into the chair before her desk, his head in his hands, and Ellawen watched him grieve for what he had destroyed, and she felt neither triumph nor pity, but only a distant, cool clarity, the settled calm of a debt finally called in. "What happens now?" he asked at last, his voice muffled and defeated. "You hold everything. The grain, the trade, the pack's survival. You could destroy us with a word. Is that why you've done all this? To watch Ashmore burn?" Ellawen returned to her side of the desk and sat, and she regarded him for a long moment before she answered. "No," she said. "I have no interest in watching Ashmore burn. There are good people in that pack, Bram and Martha and the lesser families you neglected, and 100 others who never wronged me and who would suffer for your sins if I let the pack fall. I will not punish them to punish you. That is the difference between us, Kaelin. You mistook cruelty for strength. I have learned that true strength is knowing precisely how much power you hold, and choosing, deliberately, how little of it to use." She slid a document across the desk toward him, a charter written in her own precise hand. "Ashmore will survive. It will more than survive. Under the terms I have set, with its trade restored, and its council reformed, and its enemy exposed, it will prosper as it has not prospered in years. But it will do so as a partner to Ellawen March, not as a domain of Kaelin Ashmore. I hold the grain. I hold the trade. I hold the debt that will keep the pack fed and clothed and defended against Corvin Draylock for the next decade. Which means that I hold you, Kaelin. Not as a wife, as a creditor. And I find on the whole that I much prefer this arrangement." Kaelin read the charter. His hands shook as he read it. It was, he understood, a masterpiece of quiet domination, a set of terms so favorable to the pack's survival that he could not possibly refuse them, and so total in the leverage they granted Ellawen that he would never again make a decision of any consequence without her consent. She had not conquered him with fangs. She had conquered him with figures, with contracts, with the patient accumulation of indispensable value, and there was no honor duel he could demand, no battle he could fight, no way at all to claw back the power he had lost. He had built the very desperation that now bound him. He had starved his own pack through his folly and delivered it, helpless, into the hands of the woman he had scorned. "You built the cage," Elowen said softly, and there was the faintest edge of dark irony in her voice, the first she had allowed herself. "I simply bought the key." There is a particular quality to the silence that follows total defeat, and it filled the great hall now as Calen Ashmore signed the charter that made him, in every way that mattered, the vassal of his former wife. He signed it because there was no other choice, because his people would starve if he did not, and because some part of him, the part that was, buried beneath all that pride, not entirely without honor, recognized that he deserved this, that a man who throws away a treasure has no right to complain when he must afterward buy it back at ruinous cost. When he had signed, he set down the pen and looked at her one last time, and there was in his ruined face a question he could not quite bring himself to ask aloud. Elowen understood it anyway. She had always understood him better than he had ever understood her. "No," she said gently, answering the question he had not spoken. "There is no path back to what we were. I mourned that already, Calen, a long time ago, in a set of chambers you shared with another woman while I lay awake and counted my own worth. Whatever you feel now, regret, longing, the sudden ache for a thing you didn't value until it was gone, that is your burden to carry, not mine to soothe. I forgave you some time ago. Not for your sake, for my own. Forgiveness is a door you close behind yourself so that you can walk forward unburdened. But forgiveness is not reunion, and it is not forgetting, and it is most certainly not a return to the cage." She rose again, and this time it was a dismissal, unmistakable and final. "Go home, Calen. Feed your people. Rebuild what you nearly destroyed. And the next time a beautiful stranger tells you that the tedious work of a loyal partner is beneath your notice, remember this room. Remember who kept your world turning while you looked the other way. That is the only vengeance I want, that you spend the rest of your life understanding exactly what you threw away." He left without another word. There was nothing left to say. He walked out of the great counting house of Elowen March and into the grey cinder March afternoon, a diminished man, an alpha who had learned, too late and at ruinous cost, that fangs and pride and the accident of high birth are not the same thing as worth, and that the people we treat as invisible are so often the ones holding up the sky. Elowen watched him go from the tall window above the street, and she felt the last thin thread of the old bond fray and fall silent. Not with pain now, but with something closer to release. And when he had vanished into the crowd, she turned away from the window and did not think of him again for a long while. But the story was not yet finished, because Corvin Draylock remained. He came a fortnight later, and unlike Calen, he did not come as a supplicant. He came as a predator who had discovered, belatedly, that a rival he had never bothered to notice had grown into a threat, and he came to Cindermarch not to plead, but to negotiate from what he imagined was a position of strength. Corvin was everything Calen was not, cold where Calen had been careless, patient where Calen had been impulsive, and genuinely, calculatingly dangerous in a way that Calen, for all his fangs, had never been. He understood power. He had spent a decade playing a long game to swallow the Ashmore lands, and though Elowen had wrecked that particular scheme, he was not a man to sulk over a single lost gambit when a larger opportunity had presented itself. And the larger opportunity, as he saw it, was Elowen March herself. A woman who controlled the grain and the trade of the entire northern region was not an enemy to be destroyed, but an asset to be acquired. And Corvin Draylock had acquired many assets in his long and ruthless life. He came to the counting house, expecting to charm her or intimidate her, or, if all else failed, to make her an offer so lucrative that no merchant could refuse it, a partnership between his fangs and her figures, his packs and her trade, an empire of the north with the two of them at its head. He was shown into the great hall, and Eloan received him from behind her desk, and she watched him take her measure with those cold, predatory eyes, watched him catalogue her calm and her composure and her evident wealth, and recalibrate his approach accordingly. He was clever. She would give him that. He did not underestimate her the way Kaelan had. He sat across from her with the easy confidence of a man who had never once lost a negotiation, and he laid out his proposal with genuine skill, painting a vision of the fortune and the power they might build together, appealing to her ambition, her pragmatism, her evident hunger for the security that only true dominance could provide. It was, she had to admit, an impressive performance. A lesser woman, or a woman less thoroughly educated in the true nature of men who wield power, might even have been tempted. "You've done extraordinary work," Corvin said when he had finished. "Truly, I have not been so impressed by anyone in a very long time. But you must see that what you've built is fragile. Commerce without force behind it is a house of paper, Mistress March. The packs feed from your hand now because they must. But the moment a stronger predator offers them a better arrangement, or simply takes what they need by the throat, your empire of ledgers means nothing. You need protection. You need teeth. And I have more teeth than any alpha in the north. Together, we would be untouchable." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped into something silken and persuasive. "I know your history. I know what Ashmore did to you, what my foolish half-sister helped to do. Consider this, then. With my strength behind you, you could crush Kaelan Ashmore entirely, not merely hold his debt, destroy him, take his lands, wipe his name from the mountains. I am offering you the completion of your revenge, and an empire besides. What do you say?" Eloan was quiet for a long moment. She had known this offer was coming, or something like it, and she had prepared for it, as she prepared for everything, thoroughly, patiently, from several moves away. She folded her hands upon the desk and regarded Corvin Draylock with the same cool clarity she had turned upon Kaelan, and when she spoke, her voice was pleasant and unhurried. "You've made 2 mistakes," she said, "and I don't think you've noticed either of them yet." Corvin's smile did not waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Have I?" "The first," Eloan said, "is that you believe commerce without force is a house of paper. It is a common error among men who have only ever known one kind of power. You think strength is the thing that can break another person's body. But there is a strength that can starve an army without ever drawing a blade, that can bankrupt a pack without ever crossing its borders, that can bind an alpha so thoroughly in obligation that he signs away his sovereignty with his own trembling hand, and thanks you for the mercy of it. I have that strength, Corvin. You watched me use it on Kaelan a fortnight ago. And your second mistake," she reached into the drawer of her desk and withdrew a sheaf of documents, which she slid across the polished wood toward him, "is that you assumed I didn't already hold your throat in my hand, exactly as I hold his." He looked at the documents. He was a clever man, and it did not take him long to understand what he was looking at, and Eloan watched with quiet satisfaction as the cold confidence drained from his predatory face. For the documents laid bare a truth that Corvin had believed to be his most closely guarded secret, that the Blackthorn pack, for all its fangs and all its gathering army, was not self-sufficient. Corvin had spent so lavishly and so long on his decade-long scheme to swallow Ashmore, on Seraphine, on informants, on the hoarded provisions required to sustain a war host, that his own pack now depended, as heavily as any other in the north, on southern grain to survive the winter. And the grain, all the grain, every last sack of it in the entire region, flowed through the warehouses of Elowen March. "I bought out your suppliers 8 months ago," she told him, in the same pleasant, unhurried voice. "The Cindermarch Grain Cartel, the Lowland Growers Guild, the 3 independent factors who used to sell to Blackthorn directly. I own them all now, or their debts, which amounts to the same thing. You've been buying your winter grain from me for the past 4 months, Corvin, through a chain of intermediaries carefully arranged so that you would never see my name at the end of it. You've been feeding your army from my hand while you planned to make me your junior partner. So let me correct the terms of your proposal. You are not here to offer me protection. You are here because, if I close my hand, your pack starves before the spring thaw, your war host melts away, and your rivals fall upon your weakened lands like wolves upon a wounded stag. I do not need your teeth, Corvin Draylock. I have already pulled them." The silence that followed was absolute. Corvin sat very still, the way a predator goes still when it realizes, too late, that it has wandered into a trap set by something cleverer than itself. He looked at the documents, and he looked at the woman behind the desk, and Elowen saw the exact moment when he understood that everything he had believed about the nature of power was wrong, or at least incomplete, and that he had walked into the one room in all the north where his fangs meant nothing at all. "What do you want?" he said at last. And it was not a negotiation now. It was surrender, dressed in the last rags of his dignity. "Peace," Elowen said simply. "I want the war host you've been gathering disbanded. I want the border with Ashmore honored, permanently, in a signed treaty witnessed by the other packs. I want Seraphine, wherever she is now, whatever gutter you left her to rot in, located and provided for. Not out of any affection I hold for her, but because I will not build my peace on the ruin of even my enemy's cast-off instruments. And I want your word, backed by your grain debt, that Blackthorn and Ashmore will trade fairly and live as neighbors rather than rivals, with Elowen March as the broker between them." She leaned back in her chair. "In exchange, I will feed your pack through the winter at a fair price, and I will make Blackthorn as prosperous as I am making Ashmore. I am not interested in destroying you, Corvin. Destruction is expensive, and it makes enemies of the survivors. I am interested in a north that is stable and prosperous and peaceful, because a peaceful, prosperous north is very, very good for trade. Your fangs wanted to conquer these lands. My ledgers will unite them, and you will help me do it, because the alternative is starvation, and because, unlike Kalen, you are clever enough to know a good deal when it is placed in front of you." Corvin Draylock looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, something that was almost admiration crept into his cold face. He was a predator, and he recognized at last a greater predator than himself, one who hunted not with tooth and claw, but with patience and figures and the ruthless, invisible accumulation of leverage, and who had run him to ground before he had ever known he was being hunted. "I underestimated you," he said. "Everyone underestimated you." "Yes," Elowen agreed. "That has always been my greatest advantage. I suggest in the future that you find a different one." He signed her treaty. Of course he signed it. There was nothing else for a clever man to do. And whatever else Corvin Draylock was, he was clever. And when he had signed, and the war host was disbanded, and the border sealed, and the fragile peace of the North knit together thread by patient thread through the offices of Elowen March, the woman who had once carried a breakfast tray in silence found herself, without ever having sought a crown, the single most powerful figure in the entire mountain region. Not a Luna, not a queen by marriage or by blood, but a queen in the only way that had ever truly mattered. By the undeniable, irreplaceable value of what she had built with her own 2 hands. The seasons turned. Ashmore prospered under the terms of Elowen's charter, its people fed and its trade restored, and Caelan Ashmore lived out his days as a diminished but not destroyed man, tending the pack he had nearly ruined with a new and painful humility, never remarrying, never quite recovering the swagger of his youth, and thinking of the wife he had thrown away more often than he would ever admit to another living soul. Corvin Draylock kept his treaty, as clever men keep bargains that profit them, and Blackthorn flourished alongside its old rival, the 2 packs bound not by conquest, but by commerce, both of them tributaries to the quiet empire of the woman between them. Bram lived to see the pack he loved restored to health, and died content, with Elowen's name upon his lips as a blessing rather than a title. And old Marth, dear, sharp-eyed old Marth, who had pressed an iron key into a frightened woman's hand and told her not to come back small. Marth came south at last, at Elowen's insistence, to live out her final years in comfort in a warm house in Cindermarsh, where she took great and cackling pleasure in telling anyone who would listen that she had always known, always, that the quiet little bride would one day rule them all. As for Elowen and Torvald Wren, the slow, careful thing that had grown between them over the months of their partnership deepened, in time, into something Elowen had never expected to feel again, and had certainly never expected to trust. A love built not on possession, but on partnership, not on what she could provide, but on who she was. 2 competent and self-sufficient people choosing each other freely, as equals, every single day. They never married in the end. Elowen had lost her taste for institutions that could be used to diminish a person, but they built a life together that was truer and warmer and more genuinely a home than the gilded cage of Ashmore had ever been. And when, on quiet evenings, Elowen would sometimes reach absently toward her chest as if for an old wound, she would find there not the frayed and bleeding bond of her ruined marriage, but only the steady, chosen warmth of a life she had made herself, and she would let her hand fall, and she would smile. She thought, sometimes, of that morning in the great hall of Ashmore Keep, the silver tray, the smell of Seraphine's cologne, the tearing of the bond, the copper on her tongue, and Caelan's cold, careless voice ordering her to serve. She thought of the girl she had been, who had loved him with her whole trembling heart, and believed that loyalty was a law, and she felt no bitterness any more, only a kind of distant gratitude, because that morning of ultimate betrayal had been, she understood now, the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. It had shattered the cage she had mistaken for a home. It had freed her to discover, at last, the full measure of what she was capable of, not as anyone's wife, not as anyone's Luna, not as a thing to be given and taken and discarded at another's whim, but as herself, Elowen March, a woman whose worth had never been granted by any man's affection, and could never be revoked by any man's cruelty, because she had built it, plank by plank and ledger by ledger, with her own 2 hands. They had ordered her to serve. She had become a queen instead, and she had done it not by taking their power, but by proving, beyond any possibility of doubt, that the power had been hers all along. If this story moved you, if you felt the tearing in your own chest when Elowen carried that tray, and that fierce, quiet triumph when the chair finally turned, then take a moment, right now, and let that feeling mean something. Give this video a like so that more people find their way to Elowen's story. Share it with someone you know who needs the reminder that their worth was never something to be granted by another person, and can never be taken away by anyone's cruelty. Someone who needs to hear that the people who discard us so often have no idea what they're throwing away. Subscribe to this channel and join a community that believes deeply in stories like this one. Stories of quiet strength, of dignity in pain, of the slow and patient and utterly unstoppable rise of the people the world underestimated. And before you go, tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Elowen was going to win? Was it the ring left on the pillow, the turn of the chair, or the line that undid them all? The cage they built, and the key she bought? I read everyone, and I can't wait to hear which moment made you feel your own power stir. Until next time, remember that loyalty cannot be bought, that true strength is built and never merely inherited, and that no one, ever, has the right to tell you where you belong.